Hey guys, tonight we're going to let your brain walk barefoot across a minefield of words. Soft ones, sharp ones, ancient ones wrapped in venom, and new ones disguised as memes. Imagine this, you're huddled around a fire 40,000 years ago, and someone from the next tribe over says your spear technique is primitive. You have a choice, bash his head in, or hurl an insult back. Congratulations, you've just invented civilization. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through the slush of prehistory, where communication is all grunts, glares, and occasionally clubs to the skull. Back then, speech isn't strategy, it's survival. But something changes. Slowly, awkwardly, humans stop throwing rocks and start throwing words. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. Hitting someone costs calories. Arguing? Free. That insult over your spear work is not just shade. It's the birth of diplomacy, or at least passive aggressiveness. Freud would later remark, probably while chain-smoking and blaming everything on your mother, that the first person who threw an insult instead of a stone was the founder of civilization. And weirdly, he wasn't wrong. You keep moving, stone by stone, shout by shout, into a world where words get sharper, smarter, deadlier. The ancient Greeks codify rhetoric. Sophists charge fees to teach argument like it's martial arts. You'd think Socrates would be all about free speech, but spoiler, the guy gets executed for corrupting the youth with too many questions. Historians still argue whether Athens was defending its culture or just couldn't handle a guy with infinite follow-ups. Skip ahead to Rome. Cato the Elder ends every speech, no matter the topic, with Carthage must be destroyed. Need to fix the aqueduct? Carthage must be destroyed. Lost your sandals? Carthage must be destroyed. It's not a punchline, it's messaging. The Senate listens. Eventually, Carthage is destroyed. Words work. You arrive at medieval Europe, where the church basically owns the dictionary. Speech becomes sacred or heretical, no in-between. Say the wrong thing about transubstantiation, boom, you're firewood. But then comes the printing press. Suddenly, words are everywhere. And the ruling class? Not thrilled. The ability to mass-produce pamphlets turns one monk's protest into the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's 95 Theses? The OG hate comments nailed to a door. By now, you're starting to feel it. Words are no longer just about expressing ideas. They're tools of war, revolution, rebellion. A single phrase, let them eat cake, whether Marie Antoinette actually said it or not, becomes a guillotine in syllables. Fast forward to the Enlightenment. Philosophers are writing odes to reason, while kings quietly edit those odes with red ink. Voltaire, whose real name was actually François-Marie Arouet, but let's be honest, that doesn't look great on a book spine, famously defends speech he despises. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Although, fun fact, he probably didn't say that. A biographer did. Still sounds good on t-shirts. You cross into the new world now, freshly declared United States. The First Amendment is hot off the press. An unprecedented commitment to letting people say just about anything, even if it's offensive, weird, or completely unhinged. For the founders, who had just spent years dodging British censorship and taxes on stamps. Yes, that was a thing. Free speech isn't a luxury, it's armor. But even here, early American leaders waver. The Alien and Sedition Acts, straight-up censorship. The ink on the Constitution wasn't even dry before they started gagging dissent. Historians still argue whether those laws were temporary panic or a blueprint for how easy it is to fold free speech when the heat rises. You walk through revolutions, uprisings, suffrage movements, all carried not just by bullets, but by banners, speeches, and leaflets. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony all wielded words sharper than steel. Speech becomes not just a right, but a weapon of the marginalized. But here's the twist. Just as speech begins to liberate, it also starts to isolate. The Ku Klux Klan uses free speech to spread racial terror. Propaganda machines grind truth into powder during world wars. You see a new pattern now. The same liberty that protects the oppressed also shelters the oppressor. And in your world today, words have legs.
Tweet outre un missile.
A TikTok video can start a protest or a riot or both. Hate doesn't need a soapbox anymore. It has a search bar. But you're not here to panic. You're here to understand. To trace how we got from grunted insults to global discourse. To see how something invisible can leave such lasting scars. You'll learn about courts that tried to define harm, platforms that accidentally magnify it, and people who found themselves caught between defending liberty and dodging hate. Because in the end, the story of hate speech isn't just about bad people saying bad things. It's about what you, me, and everyone else decides to tolerate. It's about where you draw the line on a street, on a comment thread, or maybe inside yourself. And if you're still with me, feet tucked in, phone on silent, maybe a warm drink in hand, then good. You're ready to keep walking. You step softly now into a courtroom where history clinks like a judge's gavel. This isn't just law, it's theater, where language wears a suit and argues for its life. Welcome to the United States, where free speech is less of a suggestion and more of a national personality trait. But just because something's in the First Amendment doesn't mean it's untouchable. In fact, America's most sacred right has been dragged through more legal mud than a tabloid celebrity. The stage is set in 1919. World War I has just ended, and emotions are running hot. Enter Charles Schenck, a man who prints 15,000 leaflets telling draftees to resist the military. He's arrested for violating the Espionage Act. The government sees sedition. He sees free expression. Cue the landmark case, Schenck versus United States. The verdict? Guilty. The Supreme Court rules that free speech can be restricted if it poses a clear and present danger, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, except, well, that metaphor's been wildly misused ever since. Historians still argue whether Schenck's actions actually endangered anything or whether the court simply buckled under post-war paranoia. Either way, it set a precedent. Speech isn't limitless. You wander through more legal landmines.
Chaplain Skiff.
New Hampshire introduces the idea of fighting words, speech that by its very nature incites violence. Think, slurs hurled across a bar with fists soon to follow. But the boundaries wobble. What if someone says something offensive, but no one throws a punch? What if the harm isn't physical but emotional? Suddenly, the law feels less like a shield and more like a blurry fence. Then there's Brandenburg versus Ohio, a case involving, you guessed it, a Ku Klux Klan leader. He delivers a speech filled with racist bile and vague threats. But the Supreme Court overturns his conviction, stating that unless speech is directed to inciting imminent lawless action, it's protected. Yep, even the KKK gets First Amendment coverage. You're not supposed to feel good about it. You're supposed to feel conflicted. It's not that America loves hate speech. It's that the alternative, letting the government decide what's hateful, is often more terrifying. You've probably heard the phrase, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Again, Voltaire didn't say that, but the sentiment rings loud in American jurisprudence. You lean into the 1960s, where protests and pushback create legal fireworks. Vietnam War dissenters burn flags, dodge drafts, chant things your grandma would blush at. Courts scramble to keep up. In Tinker versus Des Moines, students wearing black armbands to protest the war are told to take them off. The court says no, students don't lose their rights at the schoolhouse gate. One small accessory, one big moment for free speech. But contrast that with Hazelwood School District versus Coolmere, where a principal censors a school newspaper and the court says, yeah, that's fine. The difference? Schools can protect their image. So 1 minute students are revolutionaries, the next they're brand risk managers. Consistency, it seems, is not the law's strong suit. Then there's the comedy circuit. George Carlin's infamous 7 Dirty Words sketch ends up in front of the Supreme Court. FCC v. Pacifica Foundation rules that the government can regulate indecent content on public airwaves. So apparently, your right to speak depends on who's listening, what time it is, And how many of the 7 words you cram into 30 seconds? By now, you're realizing the First Amendment isn't a wall. It's a labyrinth. Even flag burning, one of the most charged acts of political expression, gets a day in court. In Texas versus Johnson, 1989, a man burns the American flag in protest. The court sides with him. Justice Brennan writes, "If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea offensive." Sounds noble, until you imagine someone doing it at your grandfather's military funeral. You also learn that corporations can speak. Citizens United v. FEC grants campaign speech rights to companies, effectively turning PACs into megaphones. It's not just individuals anymore, it's billionaires in business suits buying airspace. And here's the twist. None of these cases actually dealt with hate speech. Why? Because under US law, hate speech isn't a legal category. It has no definition. You can't sue someone just for being cruel. Unless they cross into true threats, harassment, or incitement, they're safe. You might call them a monster. The law calls them protected. That's the American firewall, brilliant, baffling, and built to withstand outrage. You might want to regulate hate, but once you start chipping away, what stops someone from calling your protest hateful? Or your sarcasm? Or your weirdly aggressive food blog? Of course, free speech has never been free of consequence. You say something awful, you might get fired, canceled, shunned, memed into oblivion. But arrested? Zuit? That's where the line glows red. And yet, America isn't immune to censorship. Not even close. From book bans in conservative counties to algorithms muting certain phrases online, speech is still regulated, just not always by the government. Sometimes it's your employer. Sometimes it's a bot. Sometimes it's the ever-watchful gaze of a million scrolling strangers. So, as you leave this courtroom of precedents and paradoxes, ask yourself this. Is absolute freedom really the answer? Or is it just the illusion that we're all equally loud in a world built on megaphones and moderators? And what happens when the next case doesn't involve a leaflet or a flag, but a live stream with a million angry eyes watching? You step out of the American courtroom and land softly in a continent where the ghosts speak in German, French, and 100 other languages, but all whisper the same thing: never again. In Europe, freedom of speech isn't a sacred right, it's a responsibility. And responsibility has consequences. Here, words aren't just metaphors, they're evidence. You arrive in Germany, and the air still feels thick with remembrance. It's not just about statues and museums. It's about laws, real, rigid ones. You can't deny the Holocaust here. You can't fly Nazi symbols. You can't publicly glorify Hitler. These aren't gray areas. They're red lines drawn in ink and memory. Why? Because Germany learned, violently, that words can pave roads to death camps. You might hear someone mutter, "Isn't that censorship?" Maybe, but when the scars are that fresh, bandages beat bleeding. Even so, historians still argue whether Germany's post-war laws are acts of atonement or just national PR in statute form. France walks a similar tightrope, criminalizes hate speech, but with flair. The French loi gaissat forbids Holocaust denial. The loi Pleven outlaws incitement to racial hatred. And when someone steps over those boundaries, like comedian Dieudonné, who shows blur satire and anti-Semitism, he's met not with debate, but with legal bans. France calls it protection. Critics call it overreach. Either way, the conversation ends in court. You scroll further east, where Poland, Hungary, and other former Soviet states have their own dance with speech. Some, like Poland, make it a crime to accuse the Polish nation of complicity in the Holocaust. It's not about denying atrocities, it's about defending national pride. But pride, as you know, is flammable. You start to wonder if these laws protect history or rewrite it. And then there's the UK, the quietly conflicted cousin. Britain doesn't have a First Amendment, just a polite balancing act between expression and civility. Hate speech laws exist, but they're fuzzy. You can be arrested for tweets that cause gross offense. Comedians like Rowan Atkinson, yes, Mr. Bean himself, have protested these restrictions, arguing that satire depends on edge. When Mr. Bean becomes a free speech activist, you know things are getting weird. In Scandinavia, you find another approach. These countries regulate hate speech with Scandinavian calm, applying laws consistently but not hysterically. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark ban speech that threatens or insults groups based on race, religion, or sexuality. But their secret weapon isn't just law, it's culture. These are societies where consensus and social shaming do a lot of the heavy lifting. Call it collective moderation. Even in Canada, your friendly maple syrup-scented neighbor to the north, you'll find Section 319 of the Criminal Code, which criminalizes public incitement of hatred. In Reverses Keekstra, a high school teacher who taught students that Jews were evil was convicted, and the conviction upheld. Free speech, not when it poisons classrooms. Still, Canada has its own tensions. Ezra Levant, a conservative journalist, once faced legal action for publishing controversial cartoons of Muhammad. He fought back, claiming that hate speech laws chill journalism. His rallying cry, "My right to offend you is more important than your right to not be offended," is bold. It's Canadian, still debated, so you start to see it. Unlike the US, where hate speech is shrugged off by the law, most democracies treat it like a loaded weapon. But they disagree on the safety mechanism. Germany bans denial. The UK arrests for tweets. Canada criminalizes incitement.
France fut satiriste.
And in all these places, the line between harm and humor gets blurrier by the day. Historians still argue whether this patchwork of laws strengthens democracy or makes it fragile. If a democracy can't tolerate ugly opinions, is it really strong? Or does tolerating them give oxygen to the flames? You walk into a French cafe and overhear an elderly man whisper, "But if we ban every offensive word, how will we know who the real monsters are?" A young woman nearby snaps back, "Why wait for them to become monsters? Cut them off while they're still just rude." This is the European dilemma. Protect dignity or tolerate danger. Ban the language or monitor the intent. In places where speech once led to genocide, the decision leans toward safety. But there are cracks. In 2018, the EU passed legislation demanding that online platforms remove illegal hate speech within 24 hours of notification. Critics called it rushed, vague, vulnerable to abuse. And while most major platforms complied, smaller voices worried. What if their dissent gets lumped into hate? What if activism gets shadow banned under the name of harmony? And that's the danger. When laws stretch to cover insulting national identity or gross offense, they stop punishing real threats and start policing tone. That angry post about Brexit, someone's hate speech, that dark joke about French politics, another offense. The net widens, the voice is thin. You duck into an underground bookstore in Prague, one of those dim, quiet places where free thinkers used to hide. A woman hands you a book banned in 1987, unbanned in 1991, ignored in 2023. She says, "Speech is like fire. It burns or it warms. Depends who's holding the match." You nod. You're learning. In Europe, history isn't theory, it's trauma. And trauma leaves rules. But the question still smolders. Is banning hate a shield for the vulnerable or a silencer for the difficult? And can a continent scarred by words ever truly trust speech again? You step back out into the cold, noticing how even graffiti here speaks softly, like it's been proofread by a lawyer. You find yourself somewhere between a protest sign and a whisper, inside the anxious breath of a person debating whether to speak up or stay small. This isn't about constitutions or courtrooms anymore. It's about daily survival in the space between someone else's free speech and your own silence. You walk alongside a young woman in a hijab entering a crowded train station. Every glance she receives is not violent. No one says a word. And yet, every look carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Or worse, assumptions. She doesn't need to be insulted out loud to feel excluded. Hate speech, in its most effective form, often works as background noise. Not a punch, just the soundtrack that tells someone you're not wanted here. For marginalized people, immigrants, queer teens, disabled workers, religious minorities, speech isn't just talk. It's climate. When the temperature rises, they can't always take off the sweater. They just sweat through it. In certain communities, you'll hear code words instead of slurs. Phrases like "those people" or "urban neighborhoods" or "real Americans." And while technically inoffensive, they carry the same weight as a brick wrapped in velvet. You start to understand. Speech is rarely about the sentence. It's about what it signals and to whom. Historians still argue whether speech ever directly causes violence. But there's less debate about what it enables. You think of Rwanda in 1994, where a radio station aired hate-fueled propaganda for months before machetes were ever raised. Tutsis were called cockroaches. Not threats, not commands, just metaphors. Harmless, right? Until they weren't. You remember Charlottesville, 2017. A white supremacist rally cloaked itself in patriotic slogans and First Amendment banners. But the chants, "Jews will not replace us," weren't debates. They were declarations. A few hours later, a woman was dead, mowed down by a car driven into a crowd. You can't prove a chant turned the wheel. But can you ignore the rhythm? You keep walking. A trans teenager scrolls through Twitter, finding debates about whether people like them should exist. Technically, no one has threatened them. But after the third thread, they close the app, turn off their phone, and don't speak for the rest of the day. That's a kind of violence too, isn't it? Silencing without laying a hand. You step inside a high school cafeteria. A black student hears the N-word shouted across the hallway, followed by laughter. When she reports it, the teacher sighs and says, "They didn't mean it that way." And suddenly, she has to decide if she's going to be that girl. The one who always complains. She doesn't fight. She just eats faster and avoids that hallway tomorrow. Multiply this by 10,000. That's the effect. Not explosion, erosion. But don't mistake this for a one-sided street. Hate speech doesn't always come from the traditionally powerful. Marginalized people can and do use harsh language too, especially online, where anonymity is a sword anyone can wield. But here's the distinction. When a slur is spoken by someone with structural power, backed by politics, history, and culture, it lands heavier. A whisper from the top hits like a shout from below. You explore the idea of punching up versus punching down. Comedians swear by it. Activists use it. Critics question whether it's even a real thing. Because if intent matters, how do you prove it? And if offense is subjective, whose offense counts? You find yourself in a synagogue vandalized with spray paint. You don't belong here. It's cleaned by morning. But the rabbi tells you, the paint comes off. The feeling stays. That feeling of being watched, warned, weighed, is the core effect of hate speech on identity. It doesn't always change laws. It changes posture, how tall someone walks, how freely they speak, whether they bring their full self into a room or leave parts of it at the door. And here's the cruel joke. The more marginalized someone is, the more they're told to just ignore it. Don't feed the trolls. Just block them. You're too sensitive. But if the harm is only ever emotional, and the response is always silence, where does it end? You notice patterns. Anti-immigrant speech increases after economic downturns. Anti-Asian speech spikes during pandemics. Anti-Muslim speech surges after terror attacks, even when the attackers share nothing but a vague religious label. Hate speech follows headlines like vultures circling fresh wounds. It's reactive, opportunistic, and always just a little louder than the voices it targets. And you start to see the dilemma. You want free speech. You want safety. But what happens when protecting one undermines the other? In communities with few resources, there's no legal recourse. They rely on allies, on public shaming, on viral videos to counter abuse. But that's exhausting. It's also inconsistent. A slur said in one state gets national attention. In another, it disappears into daily noise. So what do? You listen. You pay attention not just to what's said, but what it does. You stop asking, was it legal? And start asking, was it humane? You stop wondering, is this free speech? And start wondering, is this speech freeing anyone? Because when people withdraw, censor themselves, or vanish from public life, not because of laws, But because of the avalanche of unregulated hate, you don't have free speech anymore. You have monopolized speech, controlled not by government but by fear. You pause for a moment. The train station, the classroom, the Twitter feed, they all go quiet in your memory. And now you understand, hate speech doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like the people who stopped speaking. You wake up with your phone inches from your face. It buzzes before your eyes do. You scroll, you tap, you dive into a flood of words that someone, probably an algorithm, thinks will keep you awake just a little longer. That's not coincidence. That's design. And tonight, you're not just the user, you're the used. You're inside the algorithmic megaphone now, where the loudest voices aren't always the wisest, and hate speech isn't a failure of community. It's a feature of engagement. The angrier you get, the longer you stay. And the longer you stay, the more the machine thinks, ah, they like this. You flick past a thumbnail that reads, "They're destroying our country," with a face mid-scream. Is it satire? News? Propaganda? You're not sure. Neither is the algorithm. It just knows this kind of title performs well at 9:43 a.m. on Wednesdays. Welcome to the attention economy, where outrage is currency and hate gets premium ad placement. Historians still argue whether the printing press caused the Protestant Reformation or just helped it spread faster. But no one debates what social media has done for hate. It's given it wings, metrics, and a refresh button. You linger on a meme. It's a joke. Kind of. It says something cruel about refugees, but it's drawn like a cartoon duck, so maybe it's okay? Comments laugh. One says, based. Another drops fire emojis. You notice something. The hate here isn't shouted. It's coded. It's in-jokes, dog whistles, plausible deniability wrapped in irony. This isn't your grandfather's bigotry. It's fluent in TikTok. You jump platforms. YouTube autoplays a hot take video that starts calm but escalates fast. The host says he's just asking questions, while citing questionable stats and cherry-picked clips. The algorithm rewards him with 10,000 more eyes. And because the video got clicks, it gets pushed. Not because it's true, not because it's helpful, but because it performed. You pause. Think about that word, performed. Online, hate speech doesn't have to convince anyone. It just has to perform well. If it outrages you, provokes you, even disgusts you, it wins. Climbs the charts. And eventually, it lands in someone's recommendations. Maybe a teenager. Maybe someone lonely. Maybe someone looking for something, anything, to believe in. The rise of regefluencers is no accident. These aren't old-school radio ranters. They're slick, funny, well-lit. They mix politics with humor, offense with charisma, and sometimes their fan base includes people who take things too far. Think of the Christchurch shooter who cited online forums in his manifesto and live-streamed his mass killing like it was a gaming session. That wasn't just hate. That was hate built for virality. You start noticing how content moderation works, or more often, how it doesn't. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit all have community guidelines, but enforcement is erratic. A hate-filled post in English might get flagged. The same post in Hungarian? It slides through. Why? Moderators speak limited languages, and AI filters are trained mostly on Western contexts. You peek behind the curtain and find the content moderators, overworked contractors in low-lit offices, scrolling through the internet's worst corners for $2.50 an hour. Some quit within weeks. Others leave with PTSD. Imagine deciding 500 times a day whether a video is satire, slander, or sedition, all without clear guidance. Even worse, platforms often hesitate to act. Why? Because controversial content drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. A 30-minute live stream filled with borderline racism might generate more comments than a month's worth of wholesome cat videos. And guess which one advertisers like more when they see those sweet, sweet metrics? So you ask, who really amplifies hate speech? Is it the speaker, the listener, or the machine in between? You explore the weird underworld of shadow banning and algorithmic punishment. Some users claim their posts get less reach because they say unpopular, but not hateful things. Others get banned for sarcasm that a bot misreads as violence. In trying to fight hate, platforms often hit the wrong targets. Like someone swatting flies with a sledgehammer. Historians still argue whether censorship by algorithm is more dangerous than government censorship. At least with governments, you can vote them out. But no one elects an algorithm. No one even knows how it really works. Not even the people who build it. They just tweak, test, and optimize for engagement. Whether that means joy or chaos is a footnote. You think of the phrase, the medium is the message. Marshall McLuhan said that back in 1964. He couldn't have predicted TikTok, but he nailed the core issue. The platform you use shapes what gets said. On Twitter, brevity breeds snark. On YouTube, length rewards monologues. On Instagram, hate hides behind aesthetics. On 4chan, well, that's a whole other fever dream. And in each place, hate speech adapts, evolves, learns. It uses hashtags like camouflage. It travels in humor. It shifts tone and language depending on the audience. It even uses you, your likes, your clicks, your watch time as scaffolding. So now you wonder, can platforms fix this? Some try. Reddit banned entire communities. Facebook partnered with fact-checkers. TikTok flags misinformation. YouTube demonetizes bad actors. But enforcement is whack-a-mole. The moment one account is banned, 3 more sprout up, slightly more clever, slightly more vague. You pass through a subreddit dedicated to free speech that turns out to be mostly rage posts and conspiracy theories. But then, surprise, you find a post where someone shares their journey out of radical thinking. They credit a kind stranger who replied, "You don't have to believe this stuff to belong." Sometimes counter-speech works. Sometimes what defeats hate isn't law or bans, but one quiet person saying, "Hey, I see you. Come back." Still, you're left with the unease that the internet, as it's currently built, isn't neutral. It's tilted toward noise, outrage, repetition. And hate is very, very good at all three. You close your phone, or try to, but the words you read don't disappear. They're sticky, lingering, like smoke in a room that no longer smells like home. And as the fan hums in the background and your thoughts begin to soften, you ask yourself the hardest question yet. If hate speech goes viral by design, then what exactly are we building here? You step into a clinic without walls. There are no stretchers, no gauze, no visible blood, but the wounds here are real. You walk past people who don't limp, yet carry bruises. Not on their skin, but in their sleep. You sit beside someone who hasn't been hit, yet flinches when you speak. This is the harm hate speech causes, the kind you can't point to on an X-ray, but that shadows someone's day all the same. So you ask the uncomfortable question, what does harm actually mean? You've been told words don't hurt. Sticks and stones, right? But sticks break bones. Words reshape how you see yourself. Which one lingers longer? You scroll through studies showing that prolonged exposure to verbal abuse, especially in childhood, alters brain function. Changes how the amygdala and prefrontal cortex process threats. The brain literally adapts to expect hostility, the same way it would if you grew up in a war zone. One researcher calls it linguistic trauma. Another says it's just mental hypersensitivity. Historians still argue whether our definitions of harm have evolved or just gotten soft. You sit with a veteran of online abuse, someone who ran a feminist blog in the early 2010s. She describes waking up to rape threats, photoshopped images, emails with her home address. She didn't lose a tooth. She lost years of confidence. And for a while, her voice. The law says most of what she received wasn't true threats. Not specific enough. Not credible enough. But what if there are 1,000 vague threats? Do they average out to safety? You remember Section 230 of the U.S. Communications Decency Act, the law that gives online platforms immunity for user-generated content. It built the internet we know, and it shielded platforms from responsibility for what users post. It was meant to promote free expression. But you wonder, did it also allow harm to scale? If someone whispers something cruel in a room of 5, it hurts. If someone shouts it to 5 million people and the platform just shrugs, what then? You tiptoe through debates over microaggressions. Small, everyday jabs that chip away at a person's identity. You speak English so well. You're so articulate. Do you even need that wheelchair? They're not screams. They're paper cuts. But paper cuts, layered over time, become wounds. The pain is cumulative. Still, critics argue that expanding the definition of harm is dangerous, that it turns everyone into a potential victim and every opinion into a potential attack. They warn of a culture that encourages fragility, where discomfort is mistaken for injury, and debate becomes silence for fear of misstep. You don't dismiss them. After all, harm is subjective. What enrages one person might barely register for another. That meme you laughed at? Someone else sees their entire identity reduced to a punchline. So what do you do when harm isn't universal? When there's no consensus on where speech ends and suffering begins? You peer into legal attempts to answer that. In Canada, human rights commissions adjudicate hate speech claims not just by content, but by impact. In the UK, hate crime legislation allows increased penalties if a crime is motivated by bias, even if the speech element was just part of it. This raises eyebrows. How do you prove motivation? Is calling someone a slur during a mugging worse than mugging them silently? You sit in on a university seminar discussing harm-based speech frameworks. The lecturer argues for a tiered model. Speech that causes psychological harm, social exclusion, economic damage, and finally, physical threat. It's neat. It's intellectual. But then a student asks, if I say something that makes someone feel excluded and they drop out of school, am I liable? The room goes quiet. The line between accountability and overreach starts to dissolve. You visit a small town where a local politician was removed from office after posting racially charged jokes. He claims it was harmless, just locker room talk, but others in the community say it normalized bias, made the next racist comment seem less shocking. That's the thing about social harm, it's not always immediate. Sometimes it seeps in. Then you meet a group of activists arguing the opposite, that hate speech laws, even those rooted in harm reduction, are more symbolic than effective. They point to countries with strict laws and rising hate crimes. We've outlawed the symptom, one of them says, but we haven't treated the infection. You wonder if the law is even the right tool. Maybe the real battlefield is cultural. Maybe the true antidote is not restriction, but resilience, equipping people to recognize harmful speech and respond with strength, not silence. You return to the idea of trauma, not just for individuals, but for groups, communities that have lived for generations under verbal siege. You read a story about Indigenous youth in Canada, constantly referred to in national discourse as problems to solve. You see how even neutral language, when framed a certain way, reinforces narratives of deficiency, of inferiority. The harm isn't always in the slur. Sometimes it's in the story. So you ask again, what counts as harm? Is it fear? Is it shame? Is it the internal echo of voices that aren't yours, rewriting your worth in their language? Or is it something subtler, the erosion of your place in a conversation until you no longer show up? And when speech has that power to exclude, to isolate, to injure, how can we pretend that harm needs a bruise to be real? You walk out of the clinic with invisible bandages, not yours, but ones you've witnessed. And you begin to sense that maybe the debate isn't whether speech can hurt. That answer is clear. The real question is what kind of society we want to build. One that tells the wounded to toughen up, or one that listens when someone says, that sentence broke something in me. You step into a fog, thick with uncertainty and jargon. This is the place where hate speech stops being obvious and starts becoming slippery. It's no longer about slurs screamed in the street. It's about jokes, metaphors, dog whistles, and definitions that change with every new headline. You're in the murky realm of interpretation now. The courtroom of, did they really mean that? Welcome to the danger of vagueness. You sit at a university roundtable where professors debate what counts as hate. One says it's simple, if it targets a group for who they are, it's hate. Another counters, but what if it's satire? What if the group is powerful? What if the intent was just to provoke thought? And there it is. Intent versus impact. the unsolvable riddle. Historians still argue whether hate speech laws are meant to punish feelings or prevent future harm. And depending on the answer, enforcement becomes either a scalpel or a wrecking ball. You examine a headline, "Man fined for insulting national identity." What does that even mean? In some countries, mocking a flag or a founding myth can land you in court. But who defines what's sacred? In Thailand, criticizing the monarchy is a crime. In the US, it's a punchline. You begin to see the problem. What's hate in one culture is free speech in another. There's no global rulebook. You scroll through Twitter, where someone has been banned for saying, "I don't trust men," is framed as hate speech. Meanwhile, another account says, "Women belong in the kitchen," and remains untouched. You try to understand the logic. You fail. So do the moderators. And that's the thing, moderation isn't neutral. It reflects bias, blind spots, and sometimes political pressure. Algorithms can't read tone. AI doesn't grasp sarcasm. And people bring their own baggage to the job. You meet a college student suspended for calling out racism on campus. Her post included strong language and screenshots. The university claimed she was spreading hate. She claims she was exposing it. Both point to policy. The administration calls it safety. She calls it silencing. Somewhere in that mess is the truth, or maybe several versions of it. Then there's comedy. You wander into a late-night set where a comedian lands a controversial joke about religion. Half the audience laughs. The other half walks out. The clip goes viral. A petition demands he be banned from performing. Another petition defends him. You look at the joke again. It's edgy, yes. But is it hateful? Depends on who you are. Depends on where you're sitting. You remember Lenny Bruce, the 1960s comic who was arrested multiple times for obscenity. His routines included language that pushed boundaries, but he saw himself as a mirror, not a weapon. Today, he's a free speech icon. Back then, he was just offensive. Maybe both. You peek at modern equivalents, podcasters, streamers, influencers. They thrive on walking the line. One misstep gets them canceled. But sometimes that very controversy becomes a career boost. Outrage is branding now. You visit a classroom where students debate whether cultural appropriation counts as hate speech. One says yes, it erases and mocks. Another says no, it celebrates and shares. The professor says both might be true. The bell rings before anyone finishes their sentence. So where do we draw the line? Should the law define hate speech precisely? Or is some vagueness necessary to catch all the new ways hate evolves? You look at the law. The US avoids vague restrictions, fearing that unclear rules chill legitimate speech. The Supreme Court demands clarity. But Europe? They often err on the side of protection, even if it means accepting some gray. And in that gray, mistakes happen. You recall a case in the UK where police questioned someone for liking a tweet deemed transphobic. No arrest, no charges, just a warning. But the chilling effect? Real. The person stopped posting altogether. Supporters called it dystopian. Critics called it overdue. Everyone felt uneasy. You notice how public opinion shifts fast. 10 years ago, certain jokes were considered edgy. Now they're grounds for cancellation. And while social evolution is good, retroactive outrage creates confusion. Are we punishing the present or policing the past? You meet an artist whose gallery show was pulled for being racially insensitive. He's Asian. The piece was a critique of colonial stereotypes. But because someone misunderstood the context, the show disappeared. He shrugs and says, "I get it. Everyone's scared now. That fear, you feel it growing. Not just of being targeted, but of being misunderstood. Of saying something wrong, even if your heart was right. So people speak less, joke less, ask fewer hard questions." This, ironically, is how vague definitions of hate speech can silence not just hate, but honesty. People stop expressing uncomfortable truths. They avoid gray zones. They sanitize every sentence. And what's left is not safety, it's sterility. You read an op-ed warning of censorship by ambiguity. The author argues that when rules aren't clear, enforcement becomes arbitrary. And when speech depends on who's offended, the loudest censors win. But then you find another article just as thoughtful arguing that hate is elusive on purpose. That if laws don't allow for nuance, they'll miss the most harmful speech, the kind dressed up in polite language and plausible deniability. So you're stuck again. On one side, precision. On the other, protection. And in the middle, people trying to figure out if their next sentence is a contribution or a crime. You step back and look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about slurs or slights. It's about power. Who gets to define hate? Who gets to be heard? And who gets to decide when someone's words cross the line? Because until those answers are clear, you'll keep walking through this fog, trying to make sense of a debate where the rules are written in pencil. And all you can do is keep your voice steady, your ears open, and hope that when someone finally redraws the lines, they use a pen. You slide now into a quieter room, one lined with books that were once blacklisted, songs that were once illegal, paintings that vanished, and people who disappeared because they asked the wrong question at the wrong time. The danger here isn't hate speech. It's the creeping hush that follows when everything sounds dangerous. This is the slow-motion avalanche called censorship creep. Not a law passed in panic, but 100 tiny edits, each justified. Each just this once. Each barely noticed. Until one day, the public square feels more like a monitored hallway, and your voice echoes a little too loudly. You flip back to the 20th century. Stalin's USSR. Officially, it was a land of heroic workers and 5-year plans. Unofficially, you couldn't publish a poem unless it praised the regime. Jazz was bourgeois. Western novels were contraband. And neighbors didn't knock, they informed. Historians still argue whether Soviet censorship was purely political or partly psychological, a way to train citizens not just to obey, but to doubt their own thoughts. Either way, it worked. People stopped writing, or wrote in code, or buried manuscripts in their walls, praying someone might dig them up after the collapse. You jump to Nazi Germany, where the infamous Butcherverbrennen book burnings weren't just symbolic. They were practical, destroying ideas, erasing dissent, and the list of banned authors. Jewish thinkers, political critics, LGBTQ voices. Entire identities torched, not by firebrands but by bureaucrats in uniforms. The US has its own shadows. During the Red Scare, McCarthyism didn't just target spies. Targeted speech, a wrong association, a suspicious book on your shelf, and you could lose your job. Free speech was legal, but not safe. You see it again post 9/11. Suddenly, criticizing the military felt unpatriotic. Muslim voices were silenced, suspected, surveilled, mosques wiretapped, travelers profiled, political speech chilled, not by force but by fear. And fear is a very efficient editor. You fast forward to today's digital bonfire. But instead of flames, it's moderation panels and flagging systems. Terms of service that shift monthly. A live stream goes dark mid-broadcast. A channel disappears overnight. No warning, no appeal, just a message. Violated community guidelines. You try to figure out which guideline. You fail. So do they? You click into a banned creators Discord. The group used to discuss politics. Now it whispers. Members use code names. Avoid keywords. One writes, "Feels like we're fugitives for talking." The irony? They're not radicals, just a little too loud in the wrong direction. This is where it gets slippery. You want to stop hate speech, but how do you ensure the cure doesn't kill the patient? Because once platforms start banning harmful ideas, who decides what's harmful? Today it's racism, tomorrow criticism, next week your sarcasm about traffic cones. You stroll through a high school where To Kill a Mockingbird is banned for racially insensitive language. It's a novel about racism, banned for including racism. A student tells you, they think we can't handle discomfort. But discomfort is the point. That's how you learn. You enter a library in a small American town. Empty shelves. A sign, books under review. Titles include LGBTQ memoirs, civil rights histories, even a biology textbook with gasp a diagram of human anatomy. The review committee, 5 parents and a school board member.
No educators.
No students. You hear about states passing don't say gay bills. banning discussions of identity in classrooms. The intent, they say, is to protect children. But protect from what? Awareness? Empathy? Their own future? You scroll through a content creator's apology video. Tears, disclaimers, multiple cuts. They made a joke that aged poorly. Not hateful, just dated. But the mob wanted blood. Deplatform him. Read the comments. You wonder, when did public shaming replace dialogue? When did every misstep become a career-ending fall? Cancel culture enters your mind not as myth but as mechanism. Yes, some deserve it, but not all. And once the mechanism spins fast enough, it forgets how to stop. A friend of yours deletes their entire blog, not because they were hateful, but because they were scared of being perceived that way. You revisit a phrase from earlier, chilling effect, that slow decline in speech not from censorship itself, but from the fear of it. People pre-censor, avoid topics, edit themselves out of conversations, and that, in many ways, is more effective than banning speech outright. The silence becomes internalized. You walk into a debate forum. The topic is immigration. One side is earnest. The other is inflammatory. A moderator says, "We can't allow this argument. It's too close to hate speech." The inflammatory side leaves. So does the other. The conversation dies before it begins. You sit with a high schooler who says, "We don't talk politics in class anymore. It's too risky. We just memorize answers." And just like that, education becomes recitation, not inquiry. Even art isn't safe. A gallery cancels an exhibit because the imagery is culturally sensitive. They don't explain further. The artist shrugs. "No one wants nuance anymore," he says. "Just compliance." So you start connecting dots. The slope isn't slippery because we're censoring too much. It's slippery because we're censoring poorly, vaguely, inconsistently, with fear instead of thought. And fear doesn't make good policy. It just makes silence. Historians still argue whether censorship ever truly disappears bad ideas, or just buries them. The consensus? It doesn't disappear anything. It just drives it underground, where it festers. You think back to all the banned things you've seen, books, jokes, protests, paintings, and realize the point of protecting speech isn't to let everyone be heard. It's to keep society from forgetting how to listen. Because once you forget how to hear something offensive without collapsing, you forget how to argue, how to teach, how to grow. And then you're not silencing hate anymore. You're silencing evolution. So you leave this quiet room with a warning. Hate speech needs boundaries, but censorship needs breaks. Otherwise, tomorrow's banned voice might be yours, and you won't even get a notification. You step out of the courtroom, the comment thread, the banhammer echo chamber, and into something warmer, looser, maybe even hopeful. A neighborhood kitchen, a public park, a school gym on a Thursday night. The walls here aren't built with law. They're made of rhythm, jokes, old songs, clumsy hugs, and eye contact that lingers a second too long because someone is really, truly listening. This is culture, not the sanitized version on brochures or the clickbait kind weaponized online. This is culture as a bomb, a tool, and when done well, a quiet rebellion against hate. You walk into a barbershop in Atlanta where every customer has a story, and every joke lands with familial weight. Someone says, "Man, people online call me slurs. Here, they just call me late." Laughter. You realize, it's not that hate doesn't exist here. It just doesn't echo. The room absorbs it, disarms it. You sit in a church basement in Minnesota, where Muslim women are leading an interfaith quilting group. There are hijabs, crucifixes, rainbow pride pins. A woman leans over and says, "When we're stitching together stories, no one has time to stereotype." Another adds, "We're too busy arguing over color palettes." You start to see the pattern. When people connect offline, hate loses Wi-Fi. It doesn't vanish, but it can't multiply. Historians still argue whether the civil rights movement triumphed more through legislation or song. But what's clear is this: without the culture, without the spirituals, the marching rhythms, the speeches that became poetry, there would have been no fire to fuel the change. You think of Nina Simone's voice, trembling through Mississippi Goddamn. Not a legal argument, not even subtle, but unforgettable. And when hate speech came knocking, her piano answered with thunder. Then you visit a high school where two students started an after-school Bias Busters club. Not to scold, but to share. They take on one stereotype each week and unpack it with memes, research, and awkward laughter. It's messy, sometimes cringe, but it's working. One student says, "I used to think I had to win every argument. Now I just want to hear one I haven't heard yet." You stroll through an indie bookstore in San Francisco that hosts banned book nights. On the shelf, The Bluest Eye, Fun Home, The Hate You Give. People don't just read here, they discuss. Over tea, with strangers. You wonder why this feels radical. Then remember, open conversation is an act of resistance in an age of curated silence. You join a game night at a community center in Idaho where former white nationalists play settlers of Catan with people they once demonized. You're told that one of them began de-radicalizing after watching a stand-up routine by a black comic who joked, "I don't hate racists. I just hope they never find good Wi-Fi again." It's funny, and it worked, because sometimes the best way to defeat hate isn't with a courtroom win. It's with a new experience that makes the hate feel awkward, out of place, outdated, like a dial-up modem in a fiber-optic world. You visit a comedy club in Brooklyn. The lineup? All first-generation immigrants doing 5-minute sets about assimilation, stereotypes, and their mom's passive-aggressive texts. One comedian says, "They asked me where I'm from. I said, 'My mom's uterus.' That shut it down real quick." The room roars, not because the hate was defeated, but because it was made small. Ridiculous. You scroll through TikTok and find creators using their platforms not just to clap back at trolls, but to educate with dance, humor, sass, stats. One young queer creator ends every video with, "Still here, still smiling, still fabulous." It's not just content, it's counter-speech. You read about a cafe in Berlin that trains baristas to gently call out customers who use problematic language. "We don't cancel," says the owner. "We caffeinate and recalibrate." You think, maybe that's what society needs. Fewer bans, more lattes, and life lessons. And then there's family. You sit with a dad who once parroted stereotypes until his child came out. Now, he organizes community talks on inclusive parenting. "I used to think hate was out there," he says. "Turns out it was in my mouth. Just needed someone I loved to show me." Culture changes us not by force, but by friction. It introduces doubt in place of certainty. It replaces isolation with curiosity. It offers mirrors where we once had megaphones. But it takes effort and time, and most inconvenient of all, patience. It means listening to people who say offensive things without immediately writing them off. It means separating intent from outcome so that people can grow instead of retreating into more dangerous corners. It also means accepting that some people won't change, and that's okay. Culture's not about flipping everyone. It's about shifting the room so that hate can't stretch its legs without bumping into resistance. And resistance doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears a goofy grin and sings off-key. You return to that church basement, that high school club, that bookstore. You remember the laughter, the awkward questions, the surprising tenderness. And you realize, this is how free speech heals, not when it's weaponized, but when it's witnessed. Not when it wins, but when it weaves. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is hold space for someone else's voice. Even if it cracks a little, even if it sings off-pitch, even if it used to echo hate, but now somehow sounds like change. You find yourself now at the edge of everything we've wandered through. Laws and laughter, courts and cafes, bans and baristas, all blending into one quiet question that has never been fully answered. Can we build a society where people are truly free and truly safe? You sit down with that question like it's an old friend who's made you cancel plans more than once. You've seen what unfiltered speech can do, how it slices, isolates, incites. But you've also seen what overregulation can smother, the ability to question, dissent, joke badly, grow clumsily, or just be complicated. So you ask yourself, is there a middle ground? Not a tightrope, but a dance floor, where freedom and safety don't cancel each other out, but learn how to move together. You explore the idea of speech as architecture, not just noise but structure. Good speech doesn't just express, it builds bridges, shelters, doorways. You meet a pastor in Detroit who uses sermons to unpack racial trauma and forgiveness. You meet a drag artist in Sao Paulo whose shows double as therapy for the crowd. These aren't TED Talks, they're lifelines. You visit a virtual reality room designed to let users experience hate speech, not as viewers but as targets. It's jarring, immersive, and eye-opening. One participant removes the headset with tears. "I thought I understood," he says. "Now I feel it." You realize technology isn't just amplifying hate, it could also amplify empathy. If we choose to design it that way, you meet a policymaker working on a new bill, not to ban speech, but to fund community programs that build resilience. Workshops in schools, dialogue circles in neighborhoods, media literacy curriculums that teach kids how to decode memes and spot manipulation. We can't outlaw hate, she says, but we can shrink its audience. Historians still argue whether laws shape culture or culture shapes law. You now know the answer is yes. Both. Always. You meet a former extremist who now runs a de-radicalization program. He talks about what pulled him in, not facts, not arguments, but belonging, and what pulled him out. A mentor who said, "I know who you were. I still want to know who you could be." That's speech too. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't go viral, but goes deep. You watch a viral clip from a town hall where two people on opposite sides of an issue actually listen. They don't agree, but they laugh. They nod. They stay. Someone in the comments writes, "This is boring." Someone else replies, "Maybe that's what healing looks like." You realize that while we've spent centuries defending speech from governments, maybe it's time we also defend it for people. Not just the right to speak, but the right to be heard. Fully. Without fear. Without interruption. Without needing to pass a vibe check first. You walk through a gallery where every piece is based on a phrase someone wasn't allowed to say. One wall reads, "I'm scared." Another, "I love her." Another, shakily painted, "I need help." None of it is controversial. All of it is vital. You think maybe the most radical speech isn't edgy. Maybe it's honest. You sit on a park bench beside a mural that reads, "Use your words." 3 kids run past, yelling nonsense. One turns and shouts, "You smell like cheese." It's harmless, silly, beautiful. You smile because that's where it all begins. Learning to speak before learning to shout. And hopefully learning when not to. You take a breath. You feel the debate quieting, the dust settling, the big questions exhaling. Should we regulate hate speech? Should we protect freedom absolutely? The answer, as always, isn't in the extremes. It's in the in-between, in designing systems that are careful, not fearful, in empowering people, not punishing opinions, in recognizing that words can hurt and also heal. The point isn't to make speech safe. The point is to make us strong enough to live with it. And maybe that strength starts with one tiny shift, choosing to speak less like a weapon and more like a welcome. So tonight, as your thoughts soften, your eyelids grow heavy, and your room quiets down to just you and the hum of whatever holds you, know this: speech is messy. It always will be. But if we keep listening, really listening, maybe it doesn't have to be cruel. Maybe it can be kind. And now the room settles. Your breath slows, and the voices of protest, passion, and policy recede. Just a little, into a softer hum. No more angry headlines. No more courtroom transcripts. Just the memory of voices, some hopeful, some hurt, but all trying, in their own flawed way, to be heard. You've walked a long way tonight, haven't you? Through dusty archives and echoing chambers, from cafe tables to internet rabbit holes, tracing the path of language through every doorway it's opened and every wound it's left behind. Let that journey fade now, not disappear, just rest. Let your thoughts tangle gently like threads not yet tied off. That's okay. Some questions don't need answers right away. Some just need space, because the world is loud, and complicated, and beautiful, and broken, and your voice, still matters. So breathe. Let the chaos of ideas melt into the simplicity of silence. Let the arguments unravel, not in defeat, but in surrender to the quiet. You've done enough for tonight. You've questioned enough. You've listened enough. And when you wake, may the world feel a little more spacious, a little less binary. May you speak with courage, but also with care. And may you remember that between free speech and safe speech, there is still so much room for good speech. So rest now. The words will still be here in the morning.